Hello and welcome to Making Media Now, the Filmmakers Collaborative podcast. I'm your host, Michael Azevedo. Joining me today is Sasha Waters, the director of Mary Oliver, Saved by the Beauty of the World, a biographical documentary about poet Mary Oliver that is now playing in a limited theatrical release and which will broadcast on the PBS series American Masters in August. From a lonely childhood to literary fame, Mary Oliver's life was shaped by devotion to nature, paying attention, and the long journey toward learning to love and be loved. Her poems inspire liberals and conservatives, atheists and believers, naturalists and urbanites, speaking directly to contemporary anxieties about attention, presence, and the human relationship with the natural world. Sasha Water's film features interviews with Mary Oliver's close friends, including John Waters, features never-before personal photos, notebooks, and correspondence from her archive, and recitations of her work by Stephen Colbert, Lucy Dacus, Steve Buscemi, and Oprah Winfrey. Here's the trailer.
When you say you felt different, how did different feel to you?
Not belonging. I very much wished not to be noticed and to be left alone.
She was our most famous poet for a long time, and yet completely elusive.
I think she was always a beatnik.
Mystic. She's radical.
It was shocking. I was a girl in Ohio, and I wanted to write poems. Unheard of.
She was an independent woman who wrote the poetry she wanted to write, who loved who she wanted to love.
Molly was this charismatic, stylish, sophisticated person.
We did not have much income. We had love and work and play.
Mary's career was what this couple was about.
The winners of the 1984 Pulitzer Prizes were announced today.
Mary Oliver won the National Book Award for Poetry.
Thank you.
You could not contain her any more than you could contain the season.
I could sit for 2 hours and look at the clouds and be very silent.
Everybody thinks Mary was this little earth mother.
And that certainly wasn't the life that she led.
That was one of my frustrations with Mary's poems. She was just presenting herself in the light. What is the storm?
One of the things about traumatic experiences is that you have to go in earnestly to look at it.
Mary spent some time feeling a little unmoored.
You could hear the truck coming down the road. You know, it was...
In that way, Mary is also a good cautionary tale.
Children forget. They don't know why they have nightmares all the time.
And then you started this new book, What Can I Say That I Have Not Said Before?
Mary was very clear that it wasn't going to define her.
I got saved by poetry, and I got saved by the beauty of the world.
Making Media Now, which is available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube, is sponsored by Filmmakers Collaborative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting media makers from across the creative spectrum. From providing fiscal sponsorship to presenting an array of informative and educational programs, Filmmakers Collaborative supports creatives at every step in their journey. To learn more, visit filmmakerscollab.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please do give it a like, a share, a follow, and head on over to YouTube and, as they say, smash that subscribe button. Now on to my conversation with Sasha Waters. Sasha Waters, welcome to Making Media Now.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm really happy to be here with you.
It's a pleasure to be speaking with you about your film, Mary Oliver, Saved by the Beauty of the World, which tells the story of the life and career of Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and writer Mary Oliver. So I wanted to start out talking to you about the challenge that a filmmaker, film being a visual medium, faces when trying to essentially communicate the sublime power of something like poetry, which, you know, when somebody reads poetry, or if you're hearing poetry being read to you, it's a very subjective experience. As opposed to film, you know, we get to see the decision that you made with the imagery that's put on screen. But I'm not sure who I would attribute this to, but you've probably heard the saying too. Talking about art is like dancing about architecture. And I feel like making a film about poetry ups that challenge considerably. So were you thinking in those terms when you set out to plan sort of the narrative spine of the film, and when you determined how you were going to compose the images and marry the images, say, with the soundtrack and with the readings of the many poems that you include in the film?
Sure. I love that question. You know, I don't necessarily consider myself a documentary filmmaker. I'm more of an artist who works in film, particularly in the sort of 16 millimeter experimental film tradition, who also happens to make documentaries every now and then. So in thinking about that experimental film legacy that I come out of, I mean, there is a part of me that would love to just have, you know, long stretches of black or film leader or, you know, I mean, there are a lot of dogs, there are a lot of owls, there are a lot of flowers, but, you know, even more of that in the film, where we're just kind of flooded with this very sensory, visceral image track. But you can only go so far with that strategy, especially, you know, having a black screen when you're going to be on public television. That's not really going to cut it. So definitely thinking about the image track was something that was very important from very early on. I think we all knew we really wanted to ground the film in a sense of place, particularly Provincetown, Massachusetts, where Mary spent over 40 years of her life with her partner, Molly Cook. You know, we wanted Provincetown to be a character. So we found lots of old archival footage and imagery of Provincetown. I also went there many times to film with my 16 millimeter camera to get contemporary images, but that also, I think because they're on 16 millimeter film, feel a little more timeless and kind of visually are kind of woven together with the archives in a way that feels seamless. I also went to Ohio a couple of times and filmed there, where Mary grew up, particularly in, well, the woods that she spent time in, McCracken Woods, no longer exist. But there are these woods that are part of a kind of larger botanical garden or preserve outside of Cleveland that are very like those woods, and they're huge. And so I spent time there, which was just glorious, being able to walk through the woods with my camera and also recording sound. So yeah, thinking about the landscape was really important, and then also the kind of images that the poems themselves evoke. I think we were also thinking about those as well.
I want to talk a little bit about your thoughts on her upbringing and, you know, and how it contributed to the type of artist that she ended up being. But in watching your film, one of the many things I really enjoyed about it was your depiction of Provincetown. And you and I were just sharing that, you know, I'm talking to you from Massachusetts, and any folks who have never been to Provincetown, it is if you're looking at a map of Massachusetts, it's that very easternmost point sticking out at the end of Cape Cod. I'm about 120 miles away from there right now. But one of the things I loved about the Provincetown imagery that you captured was we're looking at footage from the 60s, from the 70s, and the last time I was in Provincetown was last fall. But at least 3 of the buildings that you showed are still there.
Oh, yes.
And I think they have the same signage.
Yeah. And so we also see... I also was really lucky to find and have access to Molly Cook, Mary's partner of many years, was a photographer.
Yes.
And in particular, she has these beautiful black and white photographs of Provincetown from the late 60s and the 70s. And again, same thing. Some of those photographs, you can look at the black and white image and see that same building with that same signage, and it hasn't changed very much. So Provincetown has changed a lot, particularly in the last 20 years. And when you go there, people who've been there a long time are very quick to talk about that because it has changed. But there is also something really timeless about it.
So Mary Oliver writes, and this is a quote from her. She says, she describes where she grew up as a dark and broken house that I came from.
Mm-hmm.
In your travels to Ohio, where she was born, aside from that line being indicative of her interiority, did you get a sense of why she might have felt that way, either in visiting locations or in talking to people who knew her during that period of her time?
Well, I mean, she's a survivor of childhood abuse, which she reveals when she's older.
Much older.
And then we kind of address that in the film, which was a challenge because, in fact, although she didn't start speaking about it publicly until she was in her 70s, she did start grappling with it privately when she was in her 40s. I think to go to that part of Ohio, I actually got more of a sense of the places that were nourishing to her, like the woods. I think she comes from this dark and broken household, but it drives her into the woods. I mean, her story is almost like, in its general outline, like a fairy tale, right? Like that she is a young child who is cast off and on her own from a very young age, and she goes to the woods where she finds adventure and also solace, and she brings her books, and so she makes these friends in the woods who are Emerson, Whitman, Thoreau, Shelley, all of the poets who she's reading and finding there, and really finding herself in that space as well. So I think it's in some ways more a sense of the solace that she found. I mean, she certainly didn't want to stay in Ohio and wanted to get away from there, but I think she was able to find her own space there, away from home as well.
At least three of the poets that you just mentioned, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, known as giants of American writing and thinking and poetry post-Civil War, and even a little bit pre-Civil War. But there's a lot of differences between them, but there's a commonality between them in the sense of, and I'm probably going to butcher this observation, but seemingly in the sense that, us mere mortals, as we move through our lives, we are sort of in the grip of greater forces. And from Emerson's take on it, certainly Thoreau's and Mary Oliver's, that greater force is nature itself.
Yes. But one way in which Mary Oliver is different is that, right, these sort of 19th century transcendentalist poets, writers, thinkers, they are very much thinking about the individual. I mean, they are thinking about the individual in relationship to nature, but Mary is thinking more, I think, about the collective and this idea of, the stars. I'm going to butcher this quote. The stars above us and the mud at our feet are a family. We are one. And so she's coming out of this tradition of 19th century transcendentalist writing, but also thinking much more cosmically about, as she says, this idea that everything has a soul.
Did you consider yourself a more of a student of her poetry, a fan of her poetry, or an expert on her poetry as you went into this project?
No, definitely not an expert. I mean, a fan and a student for sure. I mean, I'm a big reader of poetry just in general, and so I've been a fan of Mary Oliver's for a long time. Again, because I work in this kind of non-narrative, lyrical, experimental cinema tradition. There's some affinity there with poetry, I think, in this way of thinking about metaphor, like visual metaphor as opposed to verbal metaphor. But certainly no expert. So I was so happy to have so many experts to speak with, like her biographer and people who knew her, friends, and then other poets, of course, because other poets, even if they didn't know her personally, who are sort of just thinking about the tradition that she's writing in, and then also who she's influencing, coming after her.
Do you think you're able to say, what part of your psyche, what part of your soul was touched by reading Mary Oliver? Like, what buttons was she pushing for you?
Well, I think she invites us to think really expansively beyond the limits of our selves and even our bodies and our own experience. I mean, on the one hand, she's reminding us to be in our bodies, right? And to like embrace our sensory relationship to the world, but she's also, again, reminding us of our larger cosmic connection and this way of maybe, and so I think it quiets the ego, hopefully.
Yeah, and I am far from well versed or even well read in terms of poetry, but it's sort of like I like what I like, and I'm moved by what I'm moved by, and it feels to me that one of the brilliant aspects of Mary Oliver's work is her ability to enter, perhaps through something that seems kind of simplistic and sort of everyday and ordinary. And by the end of the poem, you realize, as you just said, she's grappling with thoughts and issues and feelings that are universal,
yes,
that are so comprehensive. One of the many poems that are read at great length, wonderfully, by your talented participants in your film, Stephen Colbert. Takes a few goes at it because he gets wrought up with emotion, but he reads The Summer Day. And I'm not going to read the day, but the poem rather. But the last line of that poem says, "Tell me what you plan to do with your one wild and precious life."
Yes.
That's the last line of the poem. And yet the poem comes in really just sort of ticking off observations of what a summer day is made up of. And, the metaphor would seem to be that life itself is like that summer day, sublimely beautiful, with so much to notice and participate in, right? And yet it's wild and precious and brief. And I just felt that was so emblematic of kind of the magic that she's working.
Absolutely.
When you were talking to other poets, I'm always curious about, well, these people are, professional poets. They're steeped in scholarship around poetry. What were you getting in terms of what was their sense of her brilliance and genius really within the genre?
I think it depends on who I was talking to. I mean, I do feel like this, even though she didn't like being called a nature poet, she found it limiting. I think categories in general, she felt a little boxed in by woman poet, queer poet, nature poet. She wasn't interested in any of that. But I do think her attention to the natural world and this idea of attention in general. I mean, Stephen Colbert says in the interview, or later in the film from his interview, the world is just waiting for you to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
And it's so beautiful. And this idea that there's so much in the world available to us if only we take up that invitation and pay attention. And that
she's kind of laying down the gauntlet.
Yes, and that's what Mary's poetry is doing. And a lot of that richness is in the natural world. And I think, a poet like Ada Limon, for example, who was she was the poet laureate. When we filmed with her. She's no longer, she's stepped down and finished her term, if it's called a term. She talks about needing a new nature poetry for the natural world that we live in today, right? That nature is not just this place of solace, that poetry can be a place where we can go to kind of experience our complicated feelings that include grief for the natural world that we have created and that we have impacted oftentimes in a way that's not, that isn't quite negative, right? And so I think this idea of a more complicated, nuanced relationship to the natural world is an important part of Mary Oliver's legacy.
So Mary Oliver is born in 1935, and as we mentioned, in Ohio, and she's, I believe she's in her 20s when she spent some time at a place called Steepletop, which is Edna St. Vincent Millay's house. And during this portion of the film, you also reference at this time, I mean, Mary Oliver, I don't even think she's a published poet at this point, but she would consider herself a poet. And the female poets that are known at that time are on the order of Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. Did it feel at that point in her spending that time at Steepletop that there was a momentum toward supporting the voices of female poets, culturally speaking.
So Mary is at Steepletop. She actually goes there when she's 17.
Okay.
Yeah, she's 17. She's there on and off for 6 years. So we're talking about the mid-1950s.
Yep.
I mean, maybe a little bit, just sort of starting to emerge with Plath and Sexton, and then so many poets come up after that, you know, who are Mary's contemporaries, poets like Adrienne Rich, Audre Lorde, June Jordan. So I think there is a little more attention within the culture, but I also think that Mary, one, again, she's not necessarily thinking about herself in relationship to other women poets, except for maybe Millay, who is a huge influence on her. But Millay is really the only influence who she cites, who is a woman.
Yep.
I think that's right. I'm pretty sure that's right. She's the only female poet I can think of who Mary cites. And so I would say Mary's not necessarily thinking about that. And Mary's also not really thinking about the poetry establishment. I mean, she moves to New York. She lives in Greenwich Village. She's of the world. She's paying attention. She's a huge reader of everything, of poetry, biography. She's just a lifelong, very just ferociously curious reader.
Mm-hmm.
But she's not careerist. You know, she's not looking at the. She's not like looking
I think that's
around.
an understatement.
Like she's really, you know, I'll tell you a story. Is at one point, so Mary didn't leave like diaries behind, right? But you know, there's these notebooks that you see in the film where she's scribbling things down, and there's a lot of correspondence and letters with other poets, letters with her publishers. So there's enough to get a sense. And at one point, I called Lindsay, her biographer, and I said, Lindsay, there's like no sense ever, like anywhere, that Mary was ever, you know, envious or had any petty rivalries. You know, I went to art school. Like I practically majored in envy and petty, right? I minored in envy and petty rivalries, right? And I was like, there's no sense of this. There's no sense that that she really could care less. She doesn't care what anyone else is doing. I mean, she cares as a reader, but like from a professional standpoint. And I was just amazed by this. And Lindsay said, you know, Mary does grapple with ambition, let's say. And you can see that in the poems. You know, it's in the poems. Like everything Mary grapples with, she grapples with in the poems.
Sure.
But that sense of careerism just doesn't even occur to her. And I love that, and I aspire to it so immensely.
I think that grappling with those anxieties or those preoccupations in the work actually makes it far more fascinating than, you know, if it was diaristic and there were pages upon pages around who's going to read me? How come nobody's publishing me? That, you know, that kind of thing. Tell us what it is that leads her to Provincetown and how integral her relationship with Molly Malone Cook was in making that transition and really opening up a 40-year chapter in her life.
So she and Molly lived near each other in Greenwich Village, but they actually met at Steepletop. Mary, as I had said, was there, living there on and off. Actually, Mary had left, but she was living in Greenwich Village, but she had gone back to Steepletop to visit Norma Millay, and Molly Malone Cook was there as well. She was there photographing, and they met. And Mary has this great line about how she fell hook and tumble. It was love at first sight for her, and that Molly was a little more standoffish at first, which I think Molly later maybe denied a little bit. Molly was 10 years older than Mary. And so they embarked on this relationship. It was rocky at first. They were together, then they broke up, then they got back together. But by the summer of 1964, they decided to go to Provincetown together for the summer. Molly had been going there for the summer. She had a community there. She started the first photo gallery there. But they went for the summer and they just stayed. They stayed through the fall and winter and made their lives together there.
And did you get the sense in talking to the folks that knew her during the just those pre-Provincetown years, was there any reticence in her to, embrace her sexual preference in more of a public way?
I don't think so. I mean, that never came up. I think Mary was always just who she was. I think probably, being in, Provincetown, as you learn in the film, and I think just as so many people know, is this, Norman Mailer called it the Wild West of the East. It's a very special, tolerant, open place where I think a lot of outcasts or misfits or people on the margins.
I do have to say that if you were to if you had quizzed me before I watched your film and said, which of these 7 or 8 people absolutely won't cross paths and hang out with Mary Oliver, Norman Mailer would have been on the list. I was very pleasantly surprised that their lives, and he seemed like quite a champion of her work.
Well, he was. They were friendly. They were neighbors, and that at one point they did have a falling out. I think, as a lot of people did with Mailer.
Yeah, it might have been after he stabbed one of his wives.
Yeah, it might have been after that because Molly worked for him, and Molly was his assistant for a number of years, and Mary typed some of his manuscripts.
Yeah.
So they did know him, and they worked with him, and Provincetown is pretty small, especially for people who are there year round or have places there year round. But I think. No, I don't. There was never any. John Waters says in the film that she certainly wasn't like a lesbian activist, but she was. I never got a sense that she was in the closet at any point in her life.
So she sort of, I'm not going to say toils because it doesn't come across as toiling, in your film. The writing of the poetry is what she does. It's her reason for being alive. But a review, I believe, by Joyce Carol Oates that appears in the Times.
No, that review was in the New Republic.
The New Republic, okay. That seems to open a window in terms of the general public becoming informed of her. And her ascendancy from there is pretty rapid, and then it's turbocharged. I believe it's in 1984 when she wins the Pulitzer Prize. And then it's kind of hilarious that as soon as she becomes really renowned and celebrated, it's almost like the cool kids can't accept her success anymore. That she's ostracized by the intelligentsia within the poetry world.
Well, she was always, because she wasn't an academic poet, and again, she's not going to conferences or, in that kind of career. I say careerist, which has a negative connotation, but she's just not operating in that space.
Right.
And
of the academy, as they
she's
say.
not of the academy, and she's not. She's getting reviewed by Joyce Carol Oates, but there are other places where she's not getting reviewed, for example. So I will go back to what you said about her not toiling. She is toiling. She's doing what she loves.
Yes.
Which is being in the world and writing poetry.
Right.
But she is toiling in the sense that she's really poor. They are super, super poor for years and years and years. They're living very cheaply. They almost never leave Provincetown. They're clamming.
And she's in her 40s at this point.
Yeah, she was in her late 40s when she won the Pulitzer in the 80s. And so she is really just scraping by. She and Molly are scraping by for many, many years. And so when she does become more popular and more widely read, there is a little bit of a sense of her, maybe the ways in which she is accessible make her less interesting to fellow poets or some critics, some reviewers. I also think, like any art form, there are these pendulums of trends.
Absolutely.
Right, that go back and forth. And so there was a period of time when what's known as confessional poetry was very in vogue, and Mary's not really writing confessional poetry. There's the language poets, right, who are thinking, who are writing in a much more, maybe a kind of more academic discourse, and her work is a little too straightforward to be embraced by that. So I think it is interesting how, and useful and productive, because there are all these different ways to think about.
Yeah, it always strikes me as sort of levels of accessibility and her poetry is very accessible.
Yes.
Which doesn't mean it's simplistic, and it doesn't mean that, it's there's nothing condescending about it. But as you had said earlier, there is something about kind of that universality that she's writing about that I think lends itself to that. Although, that's just kind of a hunch. She does say that I got saved by poetry and I got saved by the beauty of the world, and that is the wonderful subtext of your film, saved by the beauty of the world. We mentioned Stephen Colbert a little bit earlier, and you had just referenced John Waters, the filmmaker, but also in your film, reading her poems. You have Oprah Winfrey, Steve Buscemi, Lucy Dacus, among others, Helen Bonham Carter, who was in there. If you were a filmmaker making a film about a rock and roll group or a singer-songwriter, one of the tasks you would have had to attend with was getting the rights for all the music.
Sure.
Is there a similar process when you're using long excerpts or poems in their entirety in a film such as yours?
Oh, sure. That was sort of that's the very first step, is getting an access agreement with the estate, which is controlled by her literary executor. Okay. That was something that American Masters did and kind of worked out that agreement. And one of the conditions of our access and getting permission and getting access to her boxes of letters and photos and everything in her archive was that we had to, so even before, we started anything, any research or writing or anything, I had to kind of write a preliminary proposal for the estate. We had to tell them which poems we wanted to use in the film. And we had to say, okay, we will not excerpt any poems. We had to agree that we would only use poems in their entirety.
Interesting.
Now, later, we were able to go back and say, oh, hi, can we please change this? Because once we started interviewing people, somebody's excited and they brought a book and they want to read their Mary Oliver poem, and it's like, oh, that wasn't on the list. We didn't get permission. But, and then we also did get permission to, the very opening of the film, the pre-title sequence uses excerpts. It cuts together a few different poems.
Yeah.
So we had to get permission for that. But in the beginning, we thought, okay, no excerpts, and we need to know exactly which poems we're using. So that meant like super long poems we couldn't use because, they were just too long. And so that sort of helped us to focus. But so it was things like that. So working with the literary executor and the estate, which was a really terrific experience.
And I have to say that your treatment of the poems within the film is really wonderful. There's a cue for the viewer that, okay, here's a poem. The title of the poem is written sort of in a script, on the screen. And then sometimes you actually meld two voices in the reading of a singular poem. When you were thinking about how you wanted to convey the various poems that are used in the film, was that something that came during the edit, or did that become obvious to you as you were starting to talk about the particular poems that were going to be used and how they impacted the readers of those poems?
Well, one thing my co-editor Megan Sims and I talked about was this idea of, it's funny that you mentioned like a music documentary. It's like we weren't thinking so much about music documentaries, but we were thinking about like the Hollywood musical, like how in a Hollywood musical, the musical numbers function, they both stop the action,
yes,
but move the story forward through the
absolutely.
content.
Yeah.
And so that's how we were thinking about the poem. So for example, Lucy Dacus reads the poem Don't Hesitate in the section where Mary and Molly meet and fall in love, because it's a poem about meeting someone and falling in love. But that poem is actually chronologically written much later.
Okay.
I mean, you're right. So it works in the film to bring us into this idea of falling in love, and joy is not meant to be a crumb is the last line of that poem.
Wow.
And we see all of these pairs of animals, young animals together.
Yes.
A pair of birds, a pair of butterflies, to reinforce that idea of the natural world as metaphor. So it's definitely something we were thinking about consciously, but I would say the treatment of each poem kind of emerged, like the visual treatment of each poem emerged as we were going along and as we were editing. I did know that I wanted people reading poems on camera. So like when you see Stephen Colbert reading The Summer Day, or when you see Lucy Dacus reading Don't Hesitate, they're reading from a teleprompter. So there's some readings from the teleprompter that were planned, and then other readings that are more spontaneous, where someone is picking up a book or looking up a poem on their phone because they're so excited they want to share it. And so it was kind of great to have both of those different treatments of poems included in the film.
Yeah, it's wonderfully effective. I mean, it's in the merging of the visuals that you pair with the particular poetry readings. I felt as a viewer, I am now encased in this poem and the experience of this poem. So we mentioned the famous people that folks are going to know and recognize, and then we also alluded to the academics and the professional poets. But it's also wonderful that in your film, toward the end, there's a lot of young people whose work, who have discovered the work of Mary Oliver. What did you find was resonating with them, and do you have any particular thoughts on why?
So Mary Oliver is really big on TikTok and Instagram, and I think particularly during the pandemic, her poems and quotes from her poems were circulating as memes a lot, because I think they really speak to this grief and being in nature and solitude, and how do we cope with that. So she kind of found this new audience during the pandemic. And then since then, if you were to go on TikTok, which I don't do often, but I did as research, and just type in wild geese tattoos, you will find a whole world of people showing their wild geese tattoos or reading wild geese.
Wow.
So she has this huge presence. And, for a while we thought that in the film we would include, and we do include a little bit of TikTok. We don't include anything from Instagram. And part of that was just because I feel like that visual
rapidity
flood of Instagram and TikTok is already everywhere. I didn't really need it to be in this film. But we wanted to get that sense of young people who being interested in him. So we have a little bit of TikTok. But in her archives, we found these letters that this 8th grade class had written to her. So students at this middle school in Santa Barbara had all their teacher would read them a poem every day, and it was almost always a Mary Oliver poem.
Yeah.
So one day this class of students decides that they're going to write letters to Mary Oliver. So I found these beautiful letters written by 8th graders, but by the time I found them, they're now in college.
Yeah.
So what we do is we go back and we filmed 4 of those young people as young adults in college, but reading the letters that they wrote in 8th grade and just asking them a few questions. And so that was sort of a way to include this next generation of Mary's fans.
Oh my gosh.
It was really great to meet them too.
And that was so powerful too, because it's almost this timeless evidence that there are opportunities in life, and perhaps throughout one's whole life, but it seems that there are times in life where people are more receptive to engagements with art that make them feel less alone, that make them feel like, well, I'm not the first one to have ever felt this. And I don't know if it's the 8th graders' letters you're referencing, but in some of the letters that you show in the film, there are several instances where people say, your poetry saved my life.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I mean, there are people, I mean, Mary Oliver's fan mail, you get a little bit of a sense of it in the film, but it's really epic. There is so much of it. And people sent her cards and photographs of their dogs and these very long personal narratives. No, really, these very long personal narratives. And they really loved her and appreciated her so much. And I think people really did feel like, a poem can save your life. I feel that way.
Saving lives. And then, she also was very clear-eyed around the finite nature of life.
Yeah.
And she says, I don't want to end simply having visited this world. And I think that we could tell her mission accomplished on that account.
Yeah, I think that's true.
She did far more than just visit. So the film is Mary Oliver, Saved by the World. And I know that you're about to embark on a theatrical release.
Yes.
The film will be playing on PBS as part of the American Masters series on August the 25th, but that's a little ways out. We'll remind listeners as we get closer to that date. But tell me what you know about the theatrical run, and is it paired with any types of Q&As between you and audience members, or Is it just, it's going to be out in the world and the people lucky enough to find it can go find it?
Both. Well, I'm doing a couple of Q&As, so we're really excited. We found this incredible distribution partner in Kino Lorber, just one of the legendary art house distributors. They're so wonderful. The whole team there is great. We are opening in New York City and Miami, Florida, and Pleasantville, New York, which is an hour north of New York City, and Provincetown. Those 4 places on Friday, July 3rd. So for the holiday weekend, if it's 100 degrees and you happen to be in Miami, New York, Pleasantville, or Provincetown, please go see it in the theater, because that opening weekend is really important. That determines how much, more widely it's released. And then after that, on July 10th, it goes to a bunch of other big cities: Chicago, San Francisco, Fort Worth, Santa Barbara, Seattle, etc., and then goes broader hopefully after that. So throughout July, it will be in theaters across the country. So if you have an art house theater in your neighborhood and it's not listed yet, please ask them to bring it, because it's a pretty short window. We'll be on PBS in the 3rd week of August.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for bringing the work and the brilliance of Mary Oliver to this film, and by extension to me, because I got to watch it. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Sasha Waters is the director again of Mary Oliver, Saved by the World. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it.
The summer day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last, and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?